The wind howled across the empty plains, carrying with it the bite of a coming snowstorm. The sun had already dipped behind the mountains, leaving only a thin streak of crimson light bleeding across the sky. A lone rider moved through the cold dusk, a man wrapped in a dust-worn coat, his hat pulled low against the wind. His horse trudged through the snow, its breath rising in white clouds. The man's name was Eli Turner, once a ranch hand, once a soldier, now a wanderer with no home left to claim. He hadn't planned to stop, not in this kind of weather, but as he rode past the shadow of a cabin, he caught sight of a faint flicker, a candle's glow, trembling through a frosted window. Something about that light made him pull the reins. Maybe it was instinct, maybe something else. He dismounted, boots crunching in the snow, and stepped onto the creaking porch. Inside, a woman and two small boys sat around a rough wooden table. The candle between them fought against the darkness, barely enough to light their faces. The woman was thin, her hair tied back in a loose braid, her eyes heavy with fatigue. The boys were quiet, eating slow, careful bites from bowls that looked nearly empty. Eli stood at the doorway for a moment, watching. The smell of boiled potatoes and wood smoke drifted out. He saw the woman tear a piece of bread in half and give it to the younger boy, keeping none for herself. That's when something broke inside him, something he thought had died long ago. He pushed the door open. The creak made them all look up in alarm. The boys froze. The woman's hand went to her chest. "It's all right," Eli said quietly, stepping inside. "Didn't mean to startle you." She nodded slowly, her voice soft. "We don't get visitors much." "Didn't figure you would, out here," Eli said, removing his hat. The warmth of the candlelight touched his weathered face. "Name's Eli Turner. I'm Martha, and these are my boys," she replied, glancing toward them. "Times are hard." Eli's eyes moved to the frost on the window, the cracks in the wood, the thin blanket around the boys. He felt a weight settle on his chest, the kind that comes when a man sees what he can't ignore. He took a slow breath and said softly, "Get your things." Martha looked confused. "Excuse me." He met her eyes, steady and certain. "Get your things," he repeated. "You're coming home." The words hung in the air like a promise and a storm all at once. For a moment, silence filled the cabin, heavy, uncertain, and full of questions neither dared to ask. The candle flickered between them, its flame bending as if it, too, listened. Martha's fingers tightened around the edge of the table, her voice trembling. "You don't know what you're saying, Mr. Turner. This is our home." Eli looked around slowly, at the thin walls that barely held back the wind, at the children's bare feet pressed against the cold floor, at the frost creeping along the inside of the window pane. "No," he said softly, "this is what's left of surviving, not living." Martha's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "We've got nowhere to go. My husband's gone, buried out back before last winter. The ranch he worked for took everything when he died, said we owed more than he earned. This cabin's all we've got." Eli's jaw tightened. He had seen that kind of cruelty before, men losing everything to debts they never truly owed. He took a slow breath, the memories of war and loss flashing behind his eyes. "Your husband?" he asked quietly. "His name wouldn't have been Samuel Carter, would it?" Her gaze lifted sharply. "You knew him?" Eli nodded once, slow. "We fought side by side once. He saved my life out near the border. I told him I'd pay it back someday. Guess I never thought it'd take this long to find how." Martha looked down at her hands, trembling slightly. The boys sat frozen, watching the stranger who spoke their father's name like a prayer. Eli stepped closer, his boots scraping the old wood. "I've got a small ranch west of here. Not much, but the land's good. There's room, food, and a warm fire that never dies out. You and the boys don't belong here, freezing in the dark. Samuel wouldn't want that." Martha's voice broke, barely more than a whisper. "You'd take us in, just like that?" Eli met her eyes, tired, honest eyes that had seen too much sorrow. "I'm not offering charity, ma'am. I'm offering family, a place where his boys can grow strong, a place you can call home again." The wind howled outside, rattling the door like it wanted to tear it open. The candle flickered low, then steadied again, casting a faint glow across their faces. Martha turned to her sons. The younger one looked up at her with hope she hadn't seen in his eyes for months. The older boy nodded quietly, his small voice steady. "Mama, I don't want to be cold anymore." Tears spilled down her cheeks. She looked back at Eli, this weathered stranger who carried her husband's memory, and spoke with a heart full of quiet strength. She nodded once, as if surrendering to the weight of fate. "All right," she whispered. "We'll come." Eli's expression softened, relief mingling with resolve. "Then finish your supper," he said gently. "We ride at first light." Outside, the storm thickened, but inside that small cabin, something warm began to stir, not from the candle, but from the first spark of hope they'd felt in a long, long time. The dawn came pale and bitter, washing the land in a dull gray light. Snow covered everything, the trees, the fence posts, the trail that wound down the hill. The storm had passed, but the cold had stayed behind like an uninvited ghost. Eli stood by his horse, tightening the saddle straps as the first curls of smoke rose from the cabin's chimney. His breath hung in the air, thick and slow. The door creaked open, and Martha stepped out wrapped in her shawl. Her eyes were red, not from tears but from a long night of thought. The boys followed close behind, each clutching a small bundle, the only pieces of their life they could carry. Eli turned toward them, nodding once. "You ready?" Martha hesitated, looking back at the cabin. The tiny home stood silent, the snow piled against its walls. Every board, every crack, held a memory: Samuel's laughter, the sound of her boys playing, the nights spent praying for one more day. She drew a deep breath and whispered, "Goodbye," so softly that only the wind heard her. Then she took her son's hands and walked toward Eli. He helped her mount the horse, then lifted the boys up behind her. "Hold on tight," he said, pulling his coat collar higher. The road ahead was long, but the look in their eyes told him they had already crossed a harder distance. They rode west. The sky slowly brightened, the snow glittering like shards of glass under the newborn sun. The land stretched endlessly, silent hills, scattered pines, the world untouched and wild. The boys whispered to each other, asking when they'd see the ranch, what it would look like, if there'd be animals there. Martha smiled faintly, her voice softer now. "We'll see soon, darlings. Just hold on." Eli led the way, his eyes scanning the horizon. He knew this land better than anyone. He had crossed it years ago, running from ghosts, of war, of loss, of things a man couldn't forget. But this time felt different. For the first time in years, he wasn't just surviving the road, he was guiding someone home. By noon, they reached the ridge overlooking a wide valley. Below lay a stretch of golden grass peeking through the snow, a river winding like silver, and in the distance, a small house with smoke rising from its chimney. Martha drew in a sharp breath. "Is that?" Eli nodded. "Turner Ranch," he said quietly. "It ain't much, but it's honest land." The boys cheered softly, their frozen faces breaking into smiles. Martha's eyes glistened as she whispered, "It's beautiful." Eli smiled faintly. "Ain't the prettiest thing I've seen today," he said, glancing toward her. As they began their descent toward the valley, the sound of hooves echoed through the hills like a heartbeat, steady, alive, and full of promise. The storm had ended, but the real journey had just begun. By the time they reached the valley floor, the sun had started to dip again, turning the sky to shades of copper and rose. The air smelled of pine and smoke, the kind of scent that promised warmth. After a long, cold road, Eli dismounted first and tied his horse to the post near the corral. The place wasn't grand, a weathered barn, a few fences leaning with age, and a small cabin that looked like it had fought more winters than it could count. But it was alive. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the faint sound of horses stirred from the barn. Martha slid down from the saddle, her boots sinking into the snow. Her boys jumped off behind her, their eyes wide with awe. "Mama, look," the youngest said, pointing toward a group of chickens scratching near the porch. For the first time in months, she laughed, a soft, genuine sound that warmed the quiet around them. Eli smiled. "There's more where that came from. Inside's warm. Food's on the stove." He led them up the porch and opened the door. The cabin glowed with firelight, not from a single candle but from a proper hearth blazing strong. The smell of stuff filled the air, thick with herbs and comfort. The boys ran inside, their laughter echoing through the small room. Martha stepped across the threshold slowly, her hand brushing the doorway as if to make sure it was real. "You did all this?" she asked quietly. Eli shrugged. Had some help from the folks nearby. Guess a man can build a home if he stops running long enough. She turned to him, her eyes soft. You didn't have to do this, Eli. You barely knew us. He looked at her for a long moment, the firelight flickering in his eyes. Maybe not, he said, voice low. But I knew what it felt like to come back to nothing. And I promised your husband I'd make sure his family never faced that. Her breath caught, part gratitude, part sorrow. Samuel always said you were a good man. Eli gave a small, weary smile. I'm trying to live up to that. They stood in silence for a while, watching the boys by the fire. Outside, the wind swept gently over the land. No longer cruel, just part of the world's rhythm. As the night deepened, Martha served the stew, her hands no longer trembling. The boys ate with joy, and Eli sat at the table across from them, feeling something he hadn't felt in years, belonging. When the meal was done, and the fire burned low, Martha looked across the table and said softly, Eli, what will you do now? He leaned back, his hat resting on the chair beside him. Guess I'll fix the fences, mend the barn, and see what tomorrow brings. This place ain't just mine anymore. It's ours now. Her eyes shimmered in the dim light, and for the first time, the word home didn't sound like a dream. Eli stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the quiet valley under the stars. Rest easy, Sam, he whispered. Your family's home. And as the night wrapped around them, the ranch, once silent and lonely, finally felt alive again.